Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're coming from. And welcome to this month's Media Justice Salon, hosted by the Media Action Grassroots Network, also known as Magnet. Today's salon is entitled Big Data for Big Organizing, Reducing Harm and Advancing Justice Through Data. My name is Yeshimabeit Milner, and I'm the founder and executive director of Data for Black Lives. And I'll be your host for today's Media Justice Salon. For those who are unfamiliar, Magnet is short for Media Action Grassroots Network, which is a project of the Center for Media Justice. Magnet represents nearly 100 organizations from all over the country, and together we're working to advance a people-centered media justice agenda. As a national network, Magnet amplifies local grassroots voices, ensuring the on-the-ground expertise of our members and their ability to influence media and policy debates. To learn more about this network, please visit magnet.org. And before we begin, I want to share some logistics about the webinar. The webinar will be recorded just in case one of your colleagues or friends or family could not make it today, and it will be posted on the Magnet website. We, of course, also invite you to join in on the discussion that's happening right now on Twitter using the hashtags #MediaJustice and #DataJustice. Finally, we'll hold all questions and comments from our listeners until the end of the salon. However, you can submit a question at any point through the chat box right below in your control panel. I see some folks have already been on the chat. Today we have three amazing guests who will help us explore how data impacts our everyday lives and how we can use it to win transformative campaigns for our communities. And I'll introduce everyone briefly. Our first guest speaker is Tawana. Tawana is a mother, social justice organizer, youth advocate, poet, and author. She was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, and is intricately involved in water rights advocacy, visionary organizing, and data justice work. Tawana serves as a data justice coordinator and communications assistant for the Detroit Community Technology Project and co-leads the Our Data Bodies Project, a 3-city participatory data justice research project. She's also a member of the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition and serves as a board member of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership. Thank you, Tawana. Our next guest is Jenn Cervella. Jenn has worked in politics for the better part of a decade, ranging from organizing for reproductive and environmental justice, electing Dems up and down the ballot, and fighting for dignity in all work within the labor movement. She's currently based in DC, and when not analyzing social behaviors, she is watching baseball with her cats. Before working in electoral politics, she started working for social justice campaigns in Los Angeles and Austin. She was with Equality California in 2011 and Clean Water Action in 2012. Welcome, Jenn. Our final guest speaker is Tamika Lewis. Tamika Lewis is the program coordinator for Blueprint North Carolina, directs and coordinated North Carolina Black Leadership and Organizing Collective, NC Block, and co-directs the North Carolina's Black Women's Roundtable. They currently assist partner organizations by developing and coordinating various statewide initiatives that focus on collaborative efforts, youth and civic engagement, and community development with an equity and social justice framework. Tamika has an overall passion for supporting local initiatives, developing local youth leadership, and securing resources to help unify and advance the efforts of marginalized community members. Everyone join me as I welcome each one of our guest speakers. But before we dive into our discussion, I wanted to take a few minutes to set the stage for why we're even talking about data in this way. Since the advent of computing, big data and algorithms have penetrated virtually every aspect of our social and economic lives. These new data systems have tremendous potential to empower communities of color. Tools like statistical modeling, artificial intelligence, data visualization, and crowdsourcing in the right hands are powerful instruments for fighting bias, building progressive movements, and promoting civic engagement to build real political power. But history tells a very different story, one in which data is too often wielded as an instrument of oppression, reinforcing inequality and perpetuating injustice. Redlining was a data-driven enterprise that resulted in the systematic exclusion of Black communities from key financial services. More recent trends like predictive policing, risk-based sentencing, and predatory lending are troubling variations on the same theme. Today, discrimination is a high-tech enterprise. But I started Data for Black Lives to flip the script. By breaking down the silos between activists and scientists, we are turning data into tools, weapons for social change. We believe that data is protest, data as accountability, and data as collective action. And with that, we'll move into questions for our panelists. So Jenn, let's start with you. Before we jump right into the uses of data in our communities, I'm hoping that you can break down what data is, where it's found, and how it's gathered.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So data's everything. It can range from a cookie in your internet browser following your spending habits and then showing you an ad on your Facebook feed. It can be your voter history if you're a registered voter and the address at which you're registered. This is also any elections that you voted in. The US Census is another place where a lot of data is aggregated at a local level. And all of our social media platforms track our data, our personal internet footprint. And then you can obtain public data through application program interfaces, or APIs as they're mostly known, which are basically like holes in the internet where raw data is like thrown from person to person. The US Census Bureau has a lot of the American Community Survey data and the 10-year census data open, and that is up on the census website. And then oftentimes you can download your digital footprint from your social media platforms and you can see what data is being tracked, and also like any of your streaming platforms. And then you have private sources such as like an email database if you're contacting people, any notes of phone calls, membership information, if you went knocking on doors and got responses for survey questions or something like that. And then like any sign up or attendance lists if folks came to an event or a rally or something like that.
Great, thank you, Jenn. Whether it's census data, survey data, there's so many different kinds of data. And it's really important that folks in our communities understand the different ways we can find it and ways we can collect it ourselves. Thank you, Jenn. Tawana, I'd like to turn to you for the next question. Data is often presented as objective and unbiased. And for that reason, and others, it really influences and truly governs a lot of the public policy that affects the lives of poor people and people of color. Can you talk about what type of data is being collected on our communities, and why should we be concerned about this data being presented as objective?
Absolutely. You know, a lot of times our desire to be connected influences how much data we share about ourselves. And so, especially on social media, I mean, I myself am guilty of that. You know, you want to stay connected to the world. And so you pretty much give a blueprint to how you exist in the world. And so as Jenn was talking about, a lot of that information is collected and shared and stored. And so some examples of that could include, you know, what you're buying at the grocery store and whether a policy is implemented to ensure whether you're going to get a fresh fruit market or whether you're going to get a liquor store. The income that's in your neighborhood and how they're going to determine whether or not to implement a payday loan station, or whether a banking institution might come into your neighborhood. And what a lot of people don't understand is that most cities, or even know, most cities have an open data portal, and states as well. There are over 2,600 open data portals across the world right now and growing. And so within those portals, a lot of our data is utilized not to our detriment. And a lot of the reasons why it's utilized to our detriment is because propaganda is such a powerful tool, and fear is utilized to harvest information. And so a lot of community members are volunteering information that has a direct impact on their neighborhoods. And so one of the ways we combat that in Detroit is by producing zines, open data zines, as well as doing teachings on the open data portals to not only share what data is being collected, but how you can then utilize your data to be more proactive in some of the decisions that are made in your community.
Great, thank you. I did not know that there were 2,600 open data portals available. What I did know was that in Los Angeles, their open data portal was first created to help law enforcement better use their own data, right? So when we think about why these are being created and what the purpose is, that's really important too. And I think, Tamika, this next question is for you, right? Local and federal governments, as we said, have been collecting data on our communities for decades. Some findings have been shared publicly through open data portals, while a lot of them really haven't been. How has this hurt or helped our communities?
I think that not knowing where to go and how to locate and access the information and the data, especially when you're coming from a civic or political advocacy standpoint, hurts our community because data is abstract, right? If we think about data, it's this large cloud in the sky that collects, that looms over us, that we can connect to our phones, but we can't connect to personally. And so when we start to talk to our city officials, our local government folks, and we say, this is what we need, they say, show us the information, show us the data, show us the stories. And if you don't know how to access it or you don't know the correct channels to go, it's very difficult to disaggregate that information and pull it out to present like, this is what is really happening. Even how to reclaim the data that is being collected on us to retell our stories in a way that advances our goals instead of like puts us back a couple 100 years.
Great. Let's reclaim this data, y'all. Tawana, at the Detroit Community Technology Project, you work with community members to do exactly that, demystify data and technology. Can you talk a little bit about what makes data open and equitable, and why is it important for our community members, particularly organizers, to have access to this information?
Absolutely. So we understand at Detroit Community Technology Project that a lack of information as well as misinformation is violence. And so that's one of the ways that our communities are left defenseless, is because, like Tamika just said, a lot of times you don't even know what data exists about you. And if you do know, you don't know where to retrieve that data from. And so a lot of ways that we function in the Detroit Community Technology is by reproducing information that we share with community members. We've produced opening data 1 and 2 zines. We've produced how to organize data discotheques, which we call, it's a play on words for discovering technology. And so we have these technology fairs where within the city, all around in the different districts, where community members can come and learn different information about the Open Data Portal, learn about how to request the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request for their data and their information, learn everywhere from how to secure your email account, or how to set up mechanisms that protect your information, or just how to navigate and be a good steward of technology and information in your community. Because we understand that decisions that we make don't just have an impact on us as individuals, but it has an impact on our community. And so we're helping to foster a more responsible digital ecosystem by educating community members on how to be good stewards of their information. And so we're not saying don't share a photo on Facebook, but what we're saying is when they send you that alert asking you to turn on facial recognition, decline that, use some different mechanisms of protection. And let's not let our desire to be connected blind us to some of the things that we should do to protect ourselves. We understand that just like with sex, tech is not 100% safe. There's no such thing as safe tech or safe sex, but in each instance, you need to add protections. And so that doesn't mean that you're careless with it. It means that you do the things that you need to do to minimize the harms. And so that's what we do at Detroit Community Technology Project, is we inform the public so that they can make informed decisions about how they interact with data systems.
Yes, thank you. That is a word right there. Let us be careful as we're navigating these new technologies, as we're navigating social media. Thank you. So Tamika, our data bodies, is working in 3 cities to open up data and develop tools for data justice. Could you talk about this work and share any findings from the project thus far?
Yes. So it's a 3-city project here in Charlotte, North Carolina, with Tawana Petty in Detroit, Michigan, and Mariela Saba and Stop LAPD Spine Network and out of Skid Row in LA. So to go off a little bit what I brought up earlier is like, how do we collect our stories that is grounded on the ground in our communities, those folks who are most impacted, and really uplift them and amplify their voices, and also create tools. So what ODB has done, we've collected more than 130 interviews across these 3 cities, specifically taking a look at the impacts of incarceration, water shutoffs, evictions, and people who are unhoused or homeless. And what we're finding is what I like to call this looping cycle of injustice, where folks are like, I can't get a job, so I have no money, so I lose my house, then I lose my benefits, and I'm forced to doing something we're calling survival crimes. And then I get locked up for it. And whether or not I'm incarcerated or convicted or I'm acquitted of all of the charges, then my record, this data follows me. And because of that, I can't get a job. I got evicted, so I can't get a house, right? All of these things that perpetuate violence, systematic violence, and really brings a name to it. So what we're doing is collecting those stories. We'll be launching our research at the end of this month. It's really exciting. But we also will be launching our community playbook, which is a larger zine of tools and techniques that folks, anyone, any organizer, any person in the community can take back to their community to actually teach around, like, what's in your wallet? How do we shift from power, not paranoia? What do you actually really know about data? What is it for real? What is it not? And so it's really exciting to hear people feel empowered around reclaiming that data, to reclaim their own stories and to use it as like, this is happening, y'all need to know it's happening, and we are the people who are telling it, not the folks who really never experienced data collection in the way that it's done on the ground or in our community.
Right. I know I got into data collection out of necessity. As a high school student, a young Black woman who saw suspensions and arrests happening in my schools and realized that unless we collected this data, our lives would continue to be in danger because of the police brutality that was also happening. And I think let's just shift over now that we're talking about it to safety and security, right? Oftentimes, I like to think about, for example, Stop and Frisk as being one of the largest data collection projects ever, because it was about getting young Black men, young Black women, young folks of color into the system. So Tawana, although this current administration has heightened our awareness of surveillance, we know communities of color have always been targeted for hyper-surveillance in this country. That's just like from day one. Yeah. Can you tell us or talk us through the difference between safety and security and your work educating folks in Detroit in this area?
Absolutely. One of the reasons why communities of color are so heavily surveillanced is because safety and security has been used synonymously. And so anytime city government or institutions think of safety, they really do implement security. And when they implement security, time they're selling you a dream of safety, they're adding surveillance cameras, they're adding video systems, they're adding profiling. They're adding pre-crime, if you look at New York, for example. And their idea of what makes a community safe is really heightening security and protections for institutions and police force and government entities and property. And it doesn't take people into account. And so when we talk about safety, we're talking about the community members, your neighbors. And so an alarm system on a home, for example, is not going to protect a person from harm. It may protect your property, but it's not going to protect a person from harm. And so we have to draw the distinction between what makes someone safe and what makes something secure. And so when we're teaching community technology, we're teaching folks to think about technology as something you can secure, something you can put an encryption on, something you can have your friends look at your Facebook page and say, hey, wait a minute, I saw something posted on there that didn't sound like you, I reported it. That's securing your technology and securing your digital systems. Safe is that community member who is your relationship that is looking out for you. And so we have to start to change the conversation, because anytime we allow for government entities and systems and policy to move from a security perspective, it's going to create a policy that harms the safety of community members. We can look at what's happening with the borders. We can look at what's happening with mass incarceration. We can look at what's happening with racial profiling. And those are all things that have been sold to us as safe, but we know that that is the system's way of feeling secure, and that is at our detriment. And so we have to drive home the fact that safety is something that we create as community members. It is not security.
Thank you for that, especially given the moment that we're in right now with gun control. Obviously, this is something that folks have been thinking about for a really long time, but the way that it's really become a mainstream conversation, a conversation that's dominated the airwaves. I think it's important that folks know the difference between safety and security. And I think it's important that we also really mobilize to get some policy change, get some work done. And Jenn, this is where I'm going to come back to you. You know, you've been working in politics around data collection and management for the better part of a decade. In your work in both electoral and issue-based campaigns, how have you used data to win policy, win campaigns, and to really get things done?
Yeah, I mean, the first step is like figuring out how much support you have and figuring out where your support is. If you've got to like pass a piece of legislation through a state house, for example, you want to see if the members of your organization live in strategic house districts and see if you can mobilize them to motivate a legislator to move from a maybe to a yes on legislation. It also helps us to recruit new members and to recruit new supporters of our cause, because you can like pick up folks that are in the same household or in the same event space as some folks in your membership. And then like traditionally in electoral work, it is about like predictive modeling and figuring out what traits about people make them more or less likely to vote on an issue or for a candidate that we happen to support. And a lot of that means that someone intentional has to make sure that the data is being used ethically, and making sure that your targeting isn't based on your data is not there to validate what you already believe. Your data is there to lead you in the direction of what other people are saying. And I think that that's what is most important about a human being the intermediary between the data and how political campaigns use it.
Great. Thank you. Tamika, you've also been using data to help support some local fights in Charlotte. Could you talk a little bit about these campaigns and how folks are really amazingly pushing back on oppressive policies with the support of data?
So the biggest fight right now in Charlotte is our gentrification and our housing crisis, along with the need for more police accountability, especially after Keith Lamont Scott and Justin Carr were murdered by the police department. So we're using open data portals to retell the story, using police CMPD's own information around police murders, shootings, checkpoints, overlapping that with our the gentrification or the foreclosure maps of Charlotte and how people have been displaced. Using this Our Data Bodies research project and the Center for Community Transitions and where their folks were reentering, we mapped that on top of all of these different data points. And what we found is that there's this crescent around Charlotte, the uptown of Charlotte, that is a highly targeted area for police, for gentrification, for displacement, for people who are unhoused. And then using that and creating that story and giving that to folks on the ground, community members and organizers, just when they talk to the mayor or city council around, this is what we need. This is the real story. This is what systematic oppression looks like for Black and brown people and immigrant and migrant folks in North Carolina and Charlotte specifically, doing all of that work. And then we're also using open data portals for land justice work to figure out where are some open parcels that the city owns or no one really owns or some developer owns that has not been used in the last 5 to 10 years, and really using that to occupy, free the land, free the people, and or to really navigate and try to figure out how we start to demand wholeheartedly what we can do and where we can move, especially when folks who are usually in power tell us that we can't do that, we don't even know, we don't have that idea, that's not our steez, so to speak. And they're like, actually, this is what you do, this is what we found, this is what the city has said for us, and now this is what we want, and this is the time frame that we want it in. So it feels really good for folks to so much so that some of the information that I pulled from the open data portal has not been there a week or two after when we go back to re-download it. So they're paying attention, so we have to move quickly. But,
yes.
Yeah.
Wow, yes. Thank you for that. I think in my experience, folks could not listen to us, they could deny what we're saying, but they can't deny the data that we've collected or the information that we've presented, right? And I think in closing, I want to post a question to each of you. We all agree, that data collection and its use in public policy is something with profound impact of our lives. We know this, right? But with this in mind, what do you all see on the horizon for data work in our communities and campaigns? Anybody who wants to go can jump in.
I could take a stab at it as it relates to people who've been previously incarcerated, to push policies around data collection and the stopping of it, how long criminal background checks actually exist after the person has been re-entered back into our community, and really started to advocate that private and public companies don't use third-party data collectors or background checks or any of those things as a deciding factor on whether someone can receive employment, because those are some of the things that are hurting our folks that people should be pushing on a legislative level.
I think wonderful. I'll chime in for Detroit. I'm thinking about a city that is currently still 85% Black, one of the last remaining Black meccas, and we have people here, and we are definitely a city that has suffered under about a half century of propaganda assault. And so I'm looking at how we use data and how we use technology to shape narrative, to create narrative, to counter the dominant narrative that has pretty much plagued Detroit for my entire life. And so community members, through our education, which we believe education is transformative and minimizes violence when you bring community members into the discussion, then they can utilize the data to then create a narrative around the actual reality of their community and how they've been making a way out of no way for the entire time that they've been dehumanized in the media. And so I think that that is a way to sustain movement, because you can get people engaged, but you have to sustain a movement by folks understanding the impact that they're making in their neighborhoods. And so that's one of the ways we can use data, is to reshape and shape and create new narratives for our city and globally for Africans all across the diaspora.
Jen, any thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I think I just want to add that, like, as as like companies will leverage data to sell you things that you don't know that you want yet. It's also important for us to make sure that we're using data to advocate for the policies that we need in our communities to keep ourselves safe from the legislation that comes and attacks us. And this is one way to ensure representation by speaking a language, which is data, that legislators and people in power understand and speak regularly. So the decentralization of the understanding of data is incredibly important to protecting our communities from that power structure that has used data as a point of privilege to silence us for so long.
Yes. And made data and data science and analytics totally obscure so that most folks, intentionally are left out of the conversation, are not a part, are not even at the table, right? And even if we're at the table, we don't even understand the conversation. And I think that's why the work that everybody here is doing is so important, because we're getting into a place where, again, highly automated, most of the government decision-making is driven by data. How do we get our folks not just data literacy, but algorithmic literacy, right, around these issues? So we actually we're really good on time, and we have some time for some of these awesome questions that have come in from our participants. And the first question from Sage, hey Sage, is what is a data portal? And anybody can answer that. Jenn or Tamika or Tawana, what is a data portal?
I was trying to see if Tamika was chiming in.
I was like, Tawana, this is I just know how to use them.
And I do encourage folks to actually go to Detroit Community Technology.org, and you can download our opening data zines. We have 2 of them that walk you through what the opening data portal is. But just briefly, I'll just say that it's a portal that city governments and state governments have implemented across the globe as their kind of response to opening up their data to community members. But as you've heard through this this webinar, they essentially will create more harm than good without literacy for community members. And so you have community members utilizing, the ones that do know of the portal for the most part, utilizing them against their better judgment because of this narrative of fear that drives a lot of marginalized communities. And so you have community members plugging in reports to police departments and different things, and reporting trash dumping and just different they're using them as reporting mechanisms versus utilizing the data portal to create some collaboration within your community. And so we're hoping through the education of what the data portal can be utilized as, we can become like a more beloved community and not increase militarization and profiling and policing within our communities by driving data that suggests a narrative that it essentially isn't a true narrative of our communities. And so, yeah, opening data portal, if you Google it for your state or your city, you should be able to pull it up.
Great. Thank you. And, one of the things at Data for Black Lives that I'm working on is how do we, connect with folks? There's these new roles within city governments called chief data officers. A lot of these people are really tasked with kind of administering, and they're in charge of these open data portals. For us, what our organizers had on, how do we actually get these folks to commit to racial justice and really, 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 like from the beginning, as they're going into the mayor's office, as they're working with community members, really, really, really taking those values into whatever they do. Because as we're going to see, the role of these chief data officers, the role of open data portals, and the role of more automated decision making within cities is just going to increase. So
Yeshi, can I say really quickly in response to that?
Yeah.
In Detroit, we have Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, and we had the benefit of having coalition members sit at the table quite regularly and then engage with city government to push policy, not only with the things that are on the data portal, but then we had one of our coalition members take a job at the city. And, you know, as much as we like to completely resist being in those institutions, it has been a benefit to us to have someone who is so committed to digital justice and data justice to be engaging in how we can push back around the policies. And she actually helped co-write some of the parts of the opening data portal to release information to the community. And so sometimes you have to be like Jenn, you have to be within that role, political role. It's not for me, but I advocate for people who are committed to engaging in both sides of the struggle in a humane way.
Thank you. Detroit leading the way, y'all. All right. So another question from Ashley: is there a way to remove information from this data collection vortex? Anybody have any responses to this question? How do we get our information out of this data collection vortex?
I haven't found a way yet. So if anyone knows of a way, please hit me up. But I think the first step most definitely is figuring out what data is being collected about you or what's there. So whether you try to figure out how to pay for your own background check or pull your credit report and your credit score to see what's on there. Those are some small things that we know. Or you could even go to your local police department and get your background check. And just, you might have never committed a crime or been arrested, but something might be there because somebody used your ID. But so the first step is starting to know what's on there so that way you could take corrective action to get it corrected. And usually it has to do with whatever entity you pulled it from. They have some dispute option for you to dispute the claim, and it goes through like a 3-month or 60-day process. Some of it is tiring, and if you are a victim of identity theft, what we're finding from our interviews as well is that people can't actually clean up their information because they weren't the folks who created the data, so they can't actually confirm what car they had in 2010 when they were locked up and someone stole their identity. So trying to figure out, we're trying to work right now, talk to folks and figure out what some steps they take to get those things rectified. But I don't know if there's a one shoe fits all outside of like collecting your own data and seeing what the story is. Yeah.
Great. Anybody want else answer that? Oh, great.
Well,
so
sorry.
go ahead, please.
Well, I mean, just to piggyback on what Tamika was saying, like we understand that this data is out there. Once it's out there, it's pretty much out there. It's like a photograph. Once that photo is taken, I mean, there was a time where if you tore up the Polaroid, that was the end of it. And maybe there was, you know, it was on the film, but, you know, it got lost and then you didn't really have to worry too much about it. But we're in a digital age. We're moving into the age of artificial intelligence. I would argue that some folks have been in the age of artificial intelligence much longer than we're venturing into it, and some folks are steeped in it. And because of racism, because of institutional racism and structural racism and the system that is so rooted in white supremacy, we now have artificial intelligence that's going to function from a racial lens. We think data is neutral, and we're understanding that data is not neutral. People plug in these things that now are driven by algorithms. And so the things that we have to worry about now as we move into things like driverless cars and different technologies that are going to make decisions based on how they were programmed. And so although our data might be out there, like, you know, some folks think if they delete their Instagram, then that's the end of it. You delete your Facebook page, that's the end of it. It's not the end of it, but also now you have enough knowledge to figure out how you want to navigate the systems and what are the things that you're going to live with and function differently around. We don't want you moving into paranoia because these things are being collected about you, but we do want you to feel empowered to know that if we struggle systemically around narrative, around informing one another, around teaching community technology, around what the impacts and harms of data systems are, then it's way more of us than it is of them. And so even though that information is out there, we can shift policy so that it doesn't have such a massive negative impact on us. And I think that's the direction we're going to have to go, is we're going to have to change the policy and not worry about as much about what's already out there, because it's already out there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Tawana. Great. We have another question. So another question about open data portals. So Fabian asks, can any of the panelists share a story, a specific story about how data accessed on an open data portal was harnessed to help or shred or share insights on a marginalized group? So any stories about how folks have used open data portals? Um,
I hate to take over this,
Okay.
but I'm just gonna still recommend that folks go to the opening data zines, and you'll see some of the. But I'll say that one of the things initially, the opening data portal was for community safety, was just policing. And so some of the things that we were able to push were like emergency centers for shelters for homelessness, emergency centers for, if people needed just different emergency responses. And that took longer than you might expect to push for those types of changes. Policing is still there. They're not going to get, for now, is still there. But we've just pushed back on some of the things that are accessible. We've also been able to empower community members around like the investment or I would say speculation that's happening in neighborhoods. And so we had some sessions where we taught community buildings that are happening in their neighborhoods. So they learned that like Marathon Oil was moving in and buying up a bunch of land in their community. And so that was something that if you looked at those buildings, you wouldn't have an idea that Marathon was coming a year from now, 2 years from now. And so we've just been able to use it as a mechanism for informing community members about speculation and about some of the development that's coming up the pike in their neighborhoods.
Great. Yeah, and I want to emphasize the use of maps and GIS data. I've used GIS data in different contexts, especially in Miami during my youth organizing days, to really just highlight the ways in which gentrification was impacting our communities, mapping teen pregnancy rates versus, where all the different nonprofits in the city are actually located and clustered. And just for the purpose of political education, it was awesome for us young people to just really dig in and see, hey, like this is what's happening in our community. This is what's happening in Miami, right? We, don't have access to this information. We don't feel like we really own public space or we belong in public space often, but here's how we can begin to reclaim our city. And using GIS mapping was huge for that, even, before getting to the campaign development, any of that. So I would highly suggest that as well. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yes, I love GIS mapping. I'm an advocate for GIS mapping, one from the accountability standpoint too, but also from the organizing and organizational side around doing some assessment of like who we actually are, whoever the we as a movement, as an organization, who our bases actually represent, where they're located, and then we can start to layer on what is the needs, what do we have access to, what don't we have access to. I just love it, y'all. I'm here to have any mapping conversation with anyone who ever wants to talk about it.
Yes. Great. So we still have some more time for questions. Let's see. Okay, another question from Sage. Right now, we are reclaiming data and the way data is being used as a tool of systematic oppression. What are the strategies in which we are collecting data as a way to imagine and build outside of current oppressive systems, right? So this is taking it into what is the kind of visionary strategies around data? How are people thinking about it in terms of reimagining a whole new state, a new, So anybody want to jump in and ask that and answer that question? I think that's really important.
The first thing that I think of is we're talking about gender boxes on any government forms. Those are changing across the country, and like the way that we are imagining and thinking about how we classify people is coming. That conversation is happening now, because how do you parse all of that out and figure out like how do you store all of this data? And I think that that's a really great opportunity for folks who are intentional and thinking about these issues and impacted by these issues to help shape that conversation and help the folks who are making these decisions make the decisions in an intentional and impactful way.
And also too, when we're talking about lowering the amount of police in our communities, it really means something that we have some data around who the police officers are, what their records are, and how we empower communities to actually be like, no, actually this is a no cop zone, or if we do, or if we are allowing police officers, they need to be in this certain amount of radius, and these are the people that you have that can already satisfy that. So when we start to think about how do we defund the police? How do we move towards a non-police state? How do we make sure that where communities that are primarily hotspots for re-entering don't become targets? And that how we can use that to inform and impact and mobilize our own folks locally in our communities. People are using data to justify those actions.
Great.
And I'd absolutely like to lift up the Equitable Internet Initiative in Detroit that used data, to think about the 40% of Detroiters who didn't have access to the internet and use that as an opportunity to then create an initiative that empowers digital stewards to not only create neighborhood in their own communities, but through equitable internet storytelling, education, organizing, and collaborative ownership and governance in a way that empowers community members to, to be productive despite their environment, despite the disinvestment in corporations in the neighborhoods. We use the data to flip the script and say, okay, well, 40% of Detroiters don't have access to the internet. What can we then do to empower that 40%? To then become more self-determinant. And so I definitely want to lift up the Equitable Internet Initiative, which is one of the initiatives of the Detroit Community Technology Project.
Yes, great. Thank you. I want to jump into this question, but I want to make sure that we have more time because all of our work at Data for Black Lives is about reimagining the world that we know is possible. Using tools like artificial intelligence, blockchain, all these technologies that we think belong to us too, to actually create new systems, identify opportunities for economic growth for Black communities, to, reconnect and, unify communities. I can go on, but I want to get into a question that is really highly requested, and I think this is important. Allison asks, which tools or software are you using to track and analyze data? For example, GIS, maybe somebody can explain GIS, VAN, that's the, election data tool. What are tools or software that y'all are using to track and analyze data?
My primary forms of data is the open data portals, GIS mapping. I do use the VAN, the Voter Access Network, for tracking communities, our advancement, leadership development. And then I use SurveyMonkey as a really good data gatherer because it disaggregates and makes things really pretty for you and easy to read as an evaluation tool and an assessment. So those are the things that I use. And storytelling, digital storytelling as well.
Professionally, we use VAN as our canvassing application, but we've also used texting tools like Hustle, Mobile Commons, Action Network for emails. I make maps with QGIS, Carto, and Periscope data. We store our data in Redshift, which is an Amazon Web Services service. And then I personally store data in the G Suite suite of tools. So my personal data typically lives in that server. And we also collect back all of our data on all of the mail that we send, and we'll do intelligent barcodes on any snail mail that we send to our membership and then analyze that. We also run our own polling, and we pull our own samples, which eliminates the bias from any kind of pollster, and we're involved from the pulling of the data to the calls that are sent out and the analyzing of that data, and then we present that data ourselves. So there's no third party saying, oh, well, I see this thing and it's something that we know ourselves to be true.
And I'll say that I'm probably the most analog digital person of all of the callers. And so just mostly traditional storytelling, conversation, and literature from community members. But I'll say that for the research project, our data is analyzed through Deduce. That's a system that we use to privately analyze and secure our data around research. But yeah, for the most part, and I would like to lift up an organization called We the People of Detroit too, actually. We the People of Detroit, who does data mapping around water shutoffs, and also data mapping around like the water, the health crisis is related to water shutoffs. And I'm sure you can find information on their website, wethepeopleofdetroit.com, as well as the Detroit People's Platform that does a lot of data analyzation around like mass transit and housing issues in Detroit. And then of course, Allied Media Projects, which we have a whole nother department that handles most of that type of information, but alliedmedia.org. And if you want to learn more, you can come to the AMC Allied Media Conference. Shameless plug, June 14th through 17th.
Yes, thank you. And one of the things that we use a lot, I use a lot, is RStudio. RStudio is a data analytics program. R is a programming language that's open source. So totally open source software that I use to, do all the kind of more advanced analytic stuff. But again, I think most of the data that we analyze are GIS, and I'm a big, big, big fan of Deduce. So, okay, we have 5 minutes left. Oh, we only have time for one more question, and it's so sad because y'all have some awesome questions, and it shows just how important and urgent this conversation is. So I think the last question is, what are some demands people should be making around cities opening up data? Specifically, these chief technology officers or chief data officers. That's a good question, I think, to end on. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Yes, absolutely. Get your city government engaged in a net neutrality fight. None of this will matter if we lose net neutrality. And for folks listening, you may or may not know what net neutrality is, but just think about it as in the internet not being neutral. And so that anything, you even watching this video might be something you would have had to pay for if your internet provider decided that they wanted to let you watch the video in the first place because of the political impact of the video. And so it's very important that everyone gets involved in the net neutrality fight so we can keep the internet as a commons for everyone. And so I think that I would say that that's the biggest demand right now.
Yes to that. And to also in Charlotte, we have a digital inclusion alliance where local digital data tech folks have partnered with the city to demand that they provide free and accessible or low cost internet to folks in communities where they would not regularly have access to it. And there's a digital divide playbook that's public on some Google Form network, but that's a demand that the city or wherever you are, the state or wherever is actually participating and providing free and accessible internet to people who are low income and people of color communities.
And the only thing that I would add is make sure that you can export the data and manipulate it locally, and don't let them be the tool that forces you to manipulate their data.
Yes, key. Great. Well, I think that's the close. We have a hard stop at 1:55. But I just want to really thank our speakers, Tawana, Jenn, and Tamika, for such a great dialogue. I think folks have gotten so much out of this, and I'm so excited to see what kind of new data projects folks are doing because of, hearing from your work. Of course, a recording of this webinar will be available on the Center for Media Justice site in the next few weeks. If you're not already signed on to CMJ's newsletter email list, do it now so you can get the notification of when this goes live. And once you log off, you're going to receive a short survey in your browser to help evaluate the webinar, right? So please, please, please take a minute to fill it out. We just talked about how important data is. This data is very important to help us continue to push this conversation into a real agenda, right? One other shameless plug, I know Tawana mentioned Allied Media Conference. We also host a conference, Data for Black Lives. We actually have our conference dates. They're not public, but y'all are the first to know. Our next conference is gonna be January 11th through 13th, 2019 at the MIT Media Lab. So we want everybody to come out and talk about these issues around data, so we can, again, use data to really build the world that we know is possible. And somebody please make sure that they put in the Allied Media Conference dates, because I will be there and I hope to see everybody there. Lastly, you know, Magnet is a grassroots powered organization that really relies on the contributions of friends to build power and win victories. Please consider making a donation to Magnet online, y'all. mag-net.org. Thank you so much and have a great day.